Hello and welcome to Conversations with Keith and Courtney. We are part of the clinical team here at Burtons Academy, and with our combined passion for monitoring and ventilation, we're here to rewind and remind you of the foundations and principles used to form the knowledge and understanding in everyday anaesthesia.
Well, hello and welcome back. This is episode 6 of series 3 of our podcast, and today we're going to be talking about acid-base balance, mainly to hopefully demystify it, take away some of the aura surrounding it as a confusing subject. Approached at a basic level, it's actually very easy to understand, and hopefully we can work through that today. We're going to be looking at the sort of 4 major components of acid-base disturbance. I alluded to this in the end of the last podcast. We're looking at an acidosis arising from a respiratory or a metabolic component, and an alkalosis arising from a respiratory or a metabolic component. So we've got 4 different compartments, if you like, to look at: respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis. And I know they all sound like, if you're not used to this, they all sound like confusing terms, but we're going to break it down. We're going to look at what they arise from, what's important, what causes them, and kind of look at some of the underlying fundamental principles. And I know, Courtney, from my own point of view, I should introduce you. Good morning, Courtney. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Good morning. Thank you.
It's okay. It took me quite a while to get to grips with this. I looked at lots of textbooks, studied this, and it took, I would say, a period of years to get to the point where it all begins to fall into place. And that's because I couldn't find something that would just explain it in a way that suited my approach and my brain to get the concepts. There's a lot of detail. You read books about acid base, there's a lot of detail. They love to go into, the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. They love to go into the dissociation of bicarbonate and the dissociation factors and all that. And yes, that is interesting. It does help you, but you've almost got to understand all of that side of chemistry before you can begin to understand what they're trying to tell you. So I find it quite difficult to get the bare bones of what I wanted to know. And hopefully you and I can shed some light on this for people with what we've now acquired over the years. But what was your feeling about acid base as you approached it in your career?
Oh gosh. First of all, I have never had a lecture on it when I was studying. I had no idea what acid base was. Even when I lived in New Zealand, I had never heard of it. I remember somebody coming and dropping their pet off for a procedure and, discussing pre-anesthetic blood testing for biochemistry and hematology. And they said, when you look at blood gases. And I had no idea what they were saying. And I just was like, oh yeah, no, we'll look at the kidneys and the liver. And she goes, no, blood gases, because she was a human anaesthetist. I thought, I don't know what you're talking about. And then up until really only recently, in the last few years, when I have had a blood gas piece of paper put under my nose and some of the procedures I've been in, did I really start to even know it was a thing, let alone how to read it. So I think my journey to understanding blood gases has been a very, like Alice in Wonderland, rabbit hole. I still at times, when you talk about getting a grip onto it, I just thought of this thing. I think I have a sweaty grip on it. It makes me a little bit nervous. I'm holding on to it, but I'm sweating and I'm letting go, and I'm starting to think, I've let go of the bar. I've fallen off the jungle gym or whatever, the monkey bars, whatever you call them in the UK. And I thought I had a good grip, and then I've lost it. And I think what I have read, like you say, you open up a textbook. This whole textbook's first of all dedicated to this topic, but you open up just a chapter in your favorite textbook, and still it can be quite complicated. And I've ended up having to rewrite a few things to make my own notes. And when I look at them now, they're very basic overview notes of how things are going, because I do believe I don't think it's commonly taught in an understandable way, if it's taught at all.
Yeah, I don't remember being taught it, but no. It was a little while ago now, so maybe in my memory rather than the course content. But yeah. We'll gloss over that. All right, so it is a kind of intimidating topic. I think it's really simple. We've talked a lot about CO2 in the last few podcasts, and over the series we talked about CO2 and its importance. And the last podcast really, I think, highlighted or the last couple, highlighted how important CO2 is and what it does in the body, and all that formation of bicarbonate and the control of the influence, rather, on the blood pH. And that's what we're really going to talk about today. We're going to talk about blood pH and anything that changes it. And the things that change it are acid-base disturbances. And it's all there in the title, acid-base. So with a pH of 7.4, you've got a certain number of acids in the blood, and you've got a certain number of bases, alkalis in the blood. And their combination gives you 7.4. If you change that setup, that ratio of acid to base, then you change the pH. Okay? And we don't want the pH to change. So we want to really understand what shifts it. So how can we have an acid introduced into the blood that shifts that base, that makes the blood acidic? How can we have a base introduced into the blood that makes the blood alkaline? And it works the other way. If we lose acid, we also shift the ratio, so we become alkaline. If we increase decrease the base, then we shift that and we become more acidic. So we can do it either way. We can either gain base, gain acid, or we can lose base, or we can lose acid. So it's all about the shift, the ratio between the two. If they're correct, as per the body wants them, we're at 7.4. So now we understand it's all about acids and bases. And again, acids and bases, that draws you back to chemistry lessons and your mind starts to cloud over. So we'll keep it simple. Acids are, for what we're really going to be talking about, we're really going to be talking about CO2 dissolved in water, formed carbonic acid. Yeah. That's our acid, and we're talking about protons from other metabolic processes. So those are our acidic side. They're going to affect the pH in a trend towards a lower value, so acidic. So just to recap, people, pH 7 is considered neutral, less than 7 is acidic, more than 7 is alkaline. So if we have a pH of 6, we're talking about an acid. If we have a pH of 8, we're talking about an alkaline. pH of 7 in the chemistry world, that's neutral. And in our human world, in our mammalian blood world, 7.4 is neutral. So that's where we want to be, 7.4. Okay. So now we begin to think, okay, so it's just a ratio between the two. So what influences it? Well, there's only two major tools in the body that can influence or control our acid base, really. So in other words, I'm saying if we become acidic, acidemic, there's only two things the body can do. It can use the lungs to either retain or promote CO2 loss. And that CO2 change would affect the pH, because we know the pH, if the CO2 goes up, we get a hypercapnia, and we get this tendency to, there's a respiratory acidosis, a tendency to drop the blood pH. And what's the other tool? We've got the kidney. And the kidney can't get rid of CO2, but it can get rid of bicarbonate. And that's our major base. So if we're acidic, acidemic, we can retain more bicarbonate, we can counteract that acidosis, get our pH back to normal. If we're alkalotic, then we can get rid of bicarbonate and redress the balance that way. Does that make sense, Courtney?
It does. I'm just thinking, with our kidneys, with our renal system, and the fact that they can, I guess, use this bicarbonate as a buffer. So the kidneys produce the bicarbonate.
Absolutely.
Do they produce less of it when they need to, or do they just excrete more of it when they need to?
I think that's probably the same thing, in as much as, but the trigger to, again, you're into kidneys, which isn't, as you know, my area.
Yeah.
You're into if you've got excess bicarbonate, so you've got a excess base and you want to get rid of bicarbonate, then the resorption of bicarbonate and the loss of bicarbonate. So resorption is reduced, the loss is increased, and we lose more bicarbonate in the urine. Yeah. But I think the production of bicarbonate, and don't quote me on this, but there is a production of it, but it's influenced by the level, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, but what I want to get at is these two tools. We've only got the lungs and we've only got the kidney.
Mm.
That's it. We don't normally vomit or whatever to control our acid base. So
Oh gosh.
we're only really looking at the two tools of the lungs and the kidney. That's it. And it all centers around that. That's what the body does. It says, I've got too much CO2, I'll breathe it off. I haven't got enough CO2, I'll hold some back.
Hmm.
Kidney says, I've got too much bicarbonate, I'll let it go. I haven't got enough, I'll hold it back. Two simple tools, yeah? Now, the big thing to understand, and this is, I think, what I probably didn't grasp for a long time, is the CO2 is your instant control, your bicarbonate is your long-term control.
Hmm.
Yeah? So that I like to think about the bicarbonate being like your oil tanker. I talked about this once before. Your oil tanker steaming across the sea, sees a little boat on the horizon. It's 20 miles away. It has to start making adjustments to avoid that boat now because it's got such a lot of inertia that it can't do it when it's 20 feet away from it. Yeah. And the bicarbonate is the same. You've got this massive buffering system in the body. If you want to change the pH, then it's going to take hours and hours and hours because I can't remember the figures exactly, but the amount of bicarbonate excreted by the kidney is a fraction of the CO2 excreted by the lungs. So kidney is a slow response tool of the basic control of bicarbonate, and the lungs are a rapid response tool for the control of CO2, and they both have an influence on pH. Yeah. So if you begin to get those concepts in your mind, bicarbonate is the stable buffer. Takes a long time. Kidneys change it slowly. CO2 is the labile buffer, changes really quickly, within seconds, if not, or minutes, if not seconds. And happens really quickly, and you use CO2 as your control through the lungs. So now hopefully we've got that kind of understanding. We can start to look at the 4 different types. And I explained them before. Well, let's just stick with respiration. We've been talking about respiration a lot because this is all about ventilation. So respiration. So let's talk about a respiratory acidosis. Let's think about what might happen in a respiratory acidosis. What does it mean? Okay, I'm just going to divert a little bit. Acidosis and acidemia. Just going to explain those terms. The acidosis is the process that leads to an end result. So respiratory acidosis is something where the respiratory component, that is the lungs, are tending to make the blood more acidic. That's an acidosis process. If it's successful in changing the blood pH to a low level, we have an acidemia. So the acidemia is the state, and the acidosis is the process that leads to it. Okay, so the reason I'm being a bit pedantic about that is because you can say the patient's got an acidosis. Well, yes, it has, but is it acidemic or is it alkalemic? Because it could have a concurrent alkalosis as well. And depending on the relative magnitudes of those two, you could have either an alkalemic state or an acidemic state. So good to separate those terms and talk about an acidosis as the process, an acidemia and alkalemia as the state or result. Okay, respiratory acidosis is what we've really been leading up to. If you don't breathe enough, we know that the CO2 levels in the body go up. Hypoventilation, there we are, back to that areolar ventilation equation. Not enough ventilation, CO2 will go up. CO2 goes up, we get an increase in blood pH. Yeah, because CO2 is a mild acid. I say, soda streams, Coca-Cola, these are all mild acids. You want to clean the 2p pieces, put them in Coca-Cola because the mild acid, the carbonic acid, will clean them really nicely. So they're mild acids. So our CO2 goes up, become mildly acidic. And now we have an acidosis. So the process is an acidosis. and that's a respiratory acidosis because it's influenced by hyperventilation. So respiratory acidosis gives us a drop in pH. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yep, makes sense to me.
Yeah. So if we take it the other way and we have something that makes us breathe hard faster than we normally would, increase respiratory effort, increase respiratory volume, we're going to, in terms that we use daily, blow off that CO2. So we're going to reduce that CO2. Yeah. So if the CO2 goes down, then it becomes less of an acid influencer in the body, and the pH will go up, and that's what we call a respiratory alkalosis. So I think those two are very easy to understand. Yeah.
I think so. Those have been my favorite ones. I think that's why I quite like anaesthesia. The respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalemia processes, or they're my favorite because I'm like, okay, well that's CO2. There we go. It's up or it's down. It's breathing or it's not. And then when we move to the metabolics, I mean, it's no secret that medicine nursing is where I crumble, because when we start to think about all these patients with disease processes that affect electrolytes and vomiting and all of that, I start to get very confused. But for me, the respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, I'm like, got it, nice,
got it, yes,
yeah,
okay. So, but that's respiratory because we were talking about the lungs, and the lungs can only get rid of CO2. They can't get rid of bicarbonate. They can't get rid of protons. Okay. So when we're talking about metabolic conditions, we're looking at things that affect in the plasma. We're talking about things that affect protons, H+. That's the component of an acid, and we're talking about bicarbonate. And we're talking about the balance between those two. So if we have lots of protons, for whatever reason, that's going to be, do you remember the pH is the negative log of the proton concentration?
I'm smiling because I know I've seen it and read it a million times,
Yeah.
but definitely
doesn't really matter. I think if you want to work out what the actual pH is, okay, do the math. It's a log thing. But what it really means is the more protons you have, the lower the pH. That's it. So if you have lots of protons which come from acids, then you have a low pH. So substitute protons. When I say protons, substitute that for some form of acid. Okay. So lots of protons reduce pH. We got bicarbonate. Yeah, bicarbonate is a base. It's HCO3 minus. Something with a minus on it is generally going to be a base. Okay. Unless it's a single salt like a chloride or whatever. But if it's a compound, HCO3 minus, that's generally going to be a base. So that's our base, our bicarbonate. We got that controlling our pH in the body on the metabolic component. So let's lose lots of base. That's going to change the ratio acid to base, and we're going to have relatively more acid. So loss of base means we've got an increase in pH. We've got a metabolic acidosis. Yeah. Let's gain lots of base for whatever reason. So there's some retention of bicarbonate, promoted by the physiology in the body, saying, okay, retain bicarbonate. That's going to increase the base. So the acid component is going to go down effectively. So our pH is going to go up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So more base, the more alkaline. Less base, the more acidic. So there we have it. Protons and bicarbonate control our metabolic side of things. CO2 controlling our respiratory side of things. Now, the two are interrelated. You cannot separate them. If you have a metabolic change, the body will go, okay, let me change my respiratory component to compensate. Yeah. So if you have a metabolic acidosis, let me say, so you've got you've got a low pH. What do you want to do? You want to get rid of CO2, don't you? Because the CO2 in the body tends to reduce the pH. So you're gonna breathe faster. Respiratory rate's going to go up to try and blow off that CO2. By blowing off the CO2, you're hoping to bring the pH up. So your response to a metabolic acidosis is to increase ventilation. Yeah? And it's the other way around. Metabolic alkalosis is going to lead to hyperventilation because you're going to try and retain CO2 to create an acid to offset the alkalosis, that process that's going on. So the two are interchanged, cannot separate them, but one happens quickly, one happens slowly. Yeah.
Hmm.
So is that clarifying things at all, Courtney? Is that beginning
Yeah,
to
I
make
think
sense?
that's such a nice way I just really liked how you broke down, okay, this is this is the acid we're talking about, this is the base we're talking about. If one goes up, the other has to change. And really, I think I always get in a panic with a lot of the terminology. But when we just talk about being on one side of 7.4, it starts to make a lot of sense. So yeah, the way you're explaining it now, I wish someone had explained this to me 15 years ago.
I wish someone explained it to me. It took,
Yeah.
took a long time to sort of get this concept sorted in my head. Um, so we need to think about what's in the blood in terms of um, acid base, and an acid base is going to lead to inevitably doing arterial blood gases because they form a large component of that. So when you do an arterial blood gas, you're starting to look at the pH, the CO2 level, the bicarbonate level. You often look at potassium chloride as well, and some other things. So we maybe need to think about what's going on in the blood in terms of those anions and cations. And I use those terms um, just because they get used in the text, and I don't want to carry on using them because I think they again tend to cloud the issue. So cations are things like potassium and anions and things like chloride bicarbonate. But let's just think about sodium, potassium, chloride, and bicarbonate. In terms of magnitude, for the ones with the positive, the K plus and the N plus, the sodium and the potassium, sodium is massively more abundant in interstitial and plasma fluid than sodium. Sodium is only down like 4 milliequivalents per liter. Potassium's like 104. So much, much, much greater. Yeah. So we can almost discount our sodium in terms of, our potassium in terms of what it's going to affect. Chloride, bicarbonate. Chloride's in the sort of 80s, 90s, and bicarbonate's in the sort of the mid 20s.
Hmm.
They form the most abundant components. Yeah. We've got calcium, magnesium, we've got phosphates, we've got other things as well, but they're the most abundant. So what the body's trying to do, has to keep a neutrality in terms of ions. So we have to be exactly the same number of positives as we have negatives. That's just a law of physics you can't get away from. So they have to balance. Yeah. Now, when we do a blood gas, we just make some big assumptions. We start looking at sodium because that's massive. We start looking at chloride and bicarbonate because that's massive. We start to ignore the little bitty ones because they don't always have much of an effect. So, we don't really worry about ionized calcium. Ionized calcium too much. We don't worry too much about some of the potassium levels. We don't worry about the phosphate levels. And then we've got some of the organic acids that have an effect as well. We just start to ignore those because to take all those into account would be massive.
Hmm.
And they're dominated by the other electrolytes. So we're really going to concentrate on sodium, chloride, and bicarbonate. And then if you think about it, I said they have to match. So if we're talking the same units, really equivalents, we got our sodium at 104, 105, 106. We got our chloride at 80, 90, and our bicarbonate at mid 20s. Add those together, there's going to be a little bit of a difference, and that little bit of a difference is going to be made up of all those little things that we just can't really take into account. Yeah, and that little difference is small, only 10 or so, 12 milliequivalents. That's what's referred to as the anion gap. Fancy word for saying anion gap. These are all the things that we're just going to ignore. You know, that's what anion gap actually says is fancy name, but we're going to ignore all the things that we can't be bothered to take into account. We're just going to take into account the big things because that's what really matters. Okay. So, I mean, I think there's lots of analogies out there, but it's like going to buy a second-hand car and looking at how shiny it is, how big. In fact, it hasn't got dents. In fact, all the four doors are all on it. But you're going to ignore the fact that maybe one of the tires is deflated, there's lots of hubcap or something. You're going to look at the big picture. So anion gap is looking at the big picture and just saying, okay, we know that we're going to ignore some of those little bits, but that's just the big picture. Okay. So anion gap, not a scary term, but it's really simple. Because what's the difference between the pluses in the blood and the negatives in the blood? Oh, it could be 12. Brilliant. We're normal. Or less than 12. We're normal, yeah? So that's we're going to come on to that later. But that's kind of hopefully given an idea about what anion gap's about. Because everything in the body is about balance. And everything is about changing that balance and then redressing it. I'm going to take a step back now before we go much further. We looked at the tools that we got. We got the lungs and the kidney. We looked at acid base, what that means, the influence of CO2, bicarbonate, and protons. I think it's probably worth having a little think about. We may have done this before, but why worry? Why are we going to worry about a pH change? Does it matter if our pH goes to 7.2 during our procedure? Does it matter if they don't, breathe, they become hypercapnic and their CO2 drops? Does it matter? Well, yeah, it probably does. It all has an effect because there are 4 major areas where acid-base variations have a big effect. We have an effect on respiration, we have an effect on the heart, effect on the brain, and we have an effect on probably greater component of cellular tissue metabolism. So I don't think this is the place to go into all the detail because I think that clouds the issue of what we're trying to talk about today. But let's just think about the heart. Just take it, I think, at this stage, that if you become, if there's an acidosis, so there's a tendency towards an acidemia, lots of protons flying around, it's going to have an effect on myocardial contractility. Yeah. Which isn't going to be a good thing. And it can lead to arrhythmias. It can lead to weakness of that muscle. So you've got a decreased cardiac output. It has an effect on smooth muscle as well. So you may have an effect on vasodilation or vasoconstriction in different compartments. You have a tendency towards a depressed heart and a depressed blood pressure. So hypotension, decreased cardiac output with an acidosis. So I say, we don't want to get into the detail of that, but just to be aware that there's a big effect on the heart, a big effect on the brain. You're going to have some CNS effects in humans. We see what we call an altered mental state, whether it's an acidemia or an alkalemia. And if you take it far enough, that can proceed to coma. And even in an alkalemic state, they can have seizures and tetany. Don't need to remember these things. Just be aware that you stray outside of that 7.4 nice safe zone, 7.35 to 7.45, stray outside of that, and you're working your way towards these effects. So that's why we get really worried about it.
And I think even if we don't have capnography to perhaps guide us, if we're not taking blood gas samples and running them through an analyzer because we're not in a hospital that has that kind of functionality, I think it's important to remember that just because we can't see them necessarily with our monitoring equipment or with our blood gas analyzer doesn't mean it's actually not happening to our patients. Like some of these disturbances are happening to our everyday patient, and we think, oh, blood gas is a high-tech, high hospital pieces of equipment and service that we don't provide. So it doesn't mean your patients aren't having those problems. They're not having these problems with their heart contractility, with shifts of potassium, whatnot. It doesn't mean that they're not happening just because you're not looking for them. So I think that's a take-home message. If you feel that, you perhaps weren't going to listen to this podcast because you don't do those blood gas analyses in practice, doesn't mean it isn't relatable to you and your patients. It can still be happening.
Absolutely. So you get a severe respiratory acidosis. It is possible that can lead to a hyperkalemia. And your hyperkalemia, so you'll start to see flattened P waves, elongated complexes, and then progressing to bradycardia progressing to ventricular tachycardia and other problems. That's something that happens, even whether you're measuring it or not. It's going on in the background. So I think this is because you don't have blood gases. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And the other thing I think, Courtney, I probably mentioned before we started, where we're talking about small animal, this is arterial blood gas is probably a luxury or something that's not done a lot routinely. And I don't expect you to do it for your bitch bay what have you. I understand that, but maybe your critical care patient or your long-term anaesthetic, or if you're doing ophthalmic procedures and you're blocking, then you really ought to have a good idea about how your ventilation is going, and how things and arterial blood gas would be good there. The other thing is, we're really assuming that a lot of our listeners are small animal biased, but if you're equine biased, then I think you'll find that most equine people are doing blood gases during an op. Maybe not if you're doing a quick inguinal repair or something that's simple, but if you're doing a colic, or if you're doing any sort of prolonged procedure, arthrodesis or arthroscopy, things like that, then it's basically something they do all the time. So there are people who use it routinely in practice, equine side, which we don't see on the small animal side. So we maybe people out there that will find this useful from that point of view, because they are using it every day, and it's not the domain of specialists. If you're an equine, you almost have to have it really if you're knocking horses out. Okay, so we talked about respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, and we just need to think about a metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. So with a metabolic alkalosis, we've got something in the body that's changing that pH, and if it's a metabolic acidosis, we've got something in the body that's leading to a relative increase in the acid side of the thing. So you've got that acid-base ratio. If we've got acidosis, then we've got something that's leading to an increased number of protons, or the acids in the body. Yeah, so that can be it's a ratio. So it means we could be losing bicarbonate. Yeah, so we could basically just have diarrhea. So the pancreas is producing a lot of bicarbonate going into the gut. It's not being resolved. We've got diarrhea. We've got loss of base. We're losing a lot of base. We end up with a metabolic acidosis. Yeah, so it's a loss of bicarbonate this time causing us an acidosis. It's not an increase in the protons, it's just a loss of the base. There's a metabolic acidosis. We could have a metabolic alkalosis. So we could have something that's, shall we say, this time we're losing protons. How do we lose protons? Well, vomiting, prolonged vomiting. Hydrochloric acid in the stomach is H plus and Cl minus. It's proton in solution, and it's a strong acid. So when we vomit, we lose a lot of protons. So if we lose protons, we're losing acid component. So our acid component is going down, so our base component is going up. So now we've got a metabolic alkalosis. So there's two very simple things. So diarrhea and vomiting going to give you an alkalosis or an acidosis, depending on which component you're losing. So it's not a complicated thing, really. If you lose an acid, you become alkalotic. If you lose a base, you become acidotic. Yeah, or the acidosis process starts. So I think we have the understanding now of what an acidosis is, what an alkalosis is, and how we can arrive at either a respiratory or metabolic form of both of those. I think one of the things that helped me when I was learning about this was just look at maybe some real life examples. Just look at some very basic blood gas values, interpret them logically, and begin to understand what these mean. And I think if we just maybe work through a couple of examples here, then maybe it'll become clear what these blood gas values mean. And when I say blood gas, we're going to start very simply. We're going to look at pH, we're going to look at arterial CO2, and we're going to look at bicarbonate levels. Okay, and we're just going to look at the state. And a blood gas analysis is just a look at the state, a snapshot of what that blood is doing at the time. We were taking it from the artery, which is important because that's where we want to look at the CO2 levels. We could take venous, but we wouldn't really see the same CO2 levels as the CO2 levels that are controlled by the lung. We want to see the influence of the lung, so we want an arterial sample. But we just look at those three things, then we're going to get an idea of what's going on. And to do that, to look at anything, you have to know the normal. I think we've covered this lots now. So the pH normal is 7.4. We've got some wiggle room in there. We can go down to 7.35 and go to 7.45, and we would consider that normal variation. PCO2, normal 40 millimeters of mercury. partial pressure. If that goes up to 45 down to 35, we consider that within normal range. And then bicarbonate. In milliequivalents per litre, I'm going to use the value 24 more or less throughout here. The range is kind of like 22 to 26. So let's just take the middle value 24, and that's our reference point. So we're just going to take those three things there, and I'm just going to give you some values, give you those three values, and we're just going to work through what those three values represent, what kind of disturbance they represent. Okay, so let's do this. So you've got pen and paper, you're sat at home or whatever you're doing, you're in the bath, just draw it on the mirror. pH equals 7.44, okay? And the PCO2, PA, CO2, that's the arterial CO2 is 56 millimeters of mercury. And the bicarbonate is 37 milliequivalents per litre. So just got those three values, pH, PCO2, and bicarbonate, 7.44, 56, and 37. Now, I'm going to go through my approach to this, because I think, Courtney, you've got a slightly different approach. I think it's great. We're going to show people the two different ways of looking at it. So just to start with my approach, so I look at that, I look at the pH and I go 7.44. Okay, well, it's in the normal range, isn't it? It's in the 7.35 to 7.45, but only just. So I'm going to say that something has tended for that pH to go up. So I'm looking at a pH that's tending towards an alkalemic condition. So there's an alkalemia there. My PCO2 is 56. Now that's high. It should be less than 45. Then it's 56, so that's significantly high. And I look at my bicarbonate, and that's 37. And that should be 24, as I said. So that's significantly high too. So now I need to look at those things and say, what's driving what? Okay, so let's look at let's take the PCO2, high at 56. Now that 56 being high would suggest to me it would become an acidosis. That would create an acidosis because it's high. Okay. If that were the case, if it were high, we see an acid condition, but we're seeing an alkaline condition, so it can't be the driver of this. The driver of this must be the high bicarbonate. The high bicarbonate would drive the pH high. So I look at that, I go, pH is high, bicarbonate's high. That's a metabolic alkalosis. Yeah. And what's happening is that the PCO2 is up because I got respiratory response. I got respiratory compensation that's trying to drive my PCO2 up to bring my pH down. So this is an example. This one here is an example of a metabolic alkalosis with what we call full respiratory compensation. Now we're going to come back and talk about those terms in a minute, but that's my analysis. I look at the pH. I look at what could drive that pH up. The CO2 is up, but it can't be driven by that. That would have tended to force it down. So it must be being driven up by bicarbonate. That's my analysis. That's how I do it. How do you do it, Courtney?
So mine, I come to the same conclusion as you, but as there's always 100 ways to skin a cat, I do mine a little bit differently. And I have always tried to learn blood gases by printing it out in front of me. And I'm a very visual person. I always say this. I need to draw, rip apart, have spider diagrams of things. So the way that I approach it is in 5 steps. And I'll tell you my 5 steps, and then we can apply it to that first example that you've just given. So the first step, what is the pH? Is it more acidotic or alkalotic? What is the PaCO2? More acidotic or more alkalotic? And I'm labeling it as I write these. I'm drawing on my blood gas. I look at the third thing. What is the bicarbonate? Acidotic, alkalotic. What matches? Does the pH, is that also showing more of an acid trend, and therefore our PaCO2 is showing the more acid trend? Okay, then I've got a respiratory acidosis. And then I look at what the other one's doing. So if the pH and the PaCO2 match, then I look, okay, what is the bicarbonate doing? Is that going the opposite direction? Then we have a compensation. So if I look at my 7.44, I look at that and I go, okay, it's a bit more above that nice 7.4. So therefore, we're looking at a more alkalotic looking number. Then I will go down, what is the PaCO2? That's 56. Okay, that's a more acidotic looking number. Okay, so the pH is looking alkalotic, the PaCO2 is looking more acidotic, and then I look at the bicarb. The bicarb is high, so therefore it's more alkalotic. What two match there? Okay, the pH matches the bicarb. They're both having that alkalotic looking trend. So I go, okay, I must have this metabolic alkalosis. And then I have a look at what that PaCO2 is doing. It's high, therefore it's more towards that acidotic side. Okay, we've got a bit of, well, compensation there perhaps. So that's how I apply mine. I kind of try and match I try and match things to the pH, just in the same way that you do, but I'm drawing up and down arrows and writing the words,
Yes.
AC or AL in my brain, ALK in my brain, to try and just match and think, okay, the primary disturbance here is metabolic. And then because that matches the pH, and then is it going up or down? Is it acidotic, alkalotic?
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely key. And I think if this was uh, a sort of a YouTube video, then I'd be all over the board with my arrows and things because it is. Even the way I described it, it's still visual to me. I need to look
Yep.
at that and make a mark on it and say, okay, pH is going up, and
Yes.
that's going down. So it's difficult to do this in your head. I totally appreciate that, which is why I suggested you draw it on the bathroom mirror, because if you can see it, you can
Yeah.
actually begin to draw that concept
Even if I think if
in
you
your
just
head.
put like our 7.44, I could just put an upward arrow there just to
Yeah,
represent ALK. For our PaCO2 being high, which is a more acidotic, I'd put a down arrow.
yeah,
And then for our bicarb being 37 and high, I'd put an up arrow. So we've got two up arrows there, the
yeah,
bicarb and the pH. So it must be metabolic.
yeah. So the bicarb is driving the pH and the CO2. This is we're going to come back to that. I said it was a respiratory compensation, and this is exactly what happens. Yeah.
Hmm.
So we get what started in this process. That bicarbonate's gone up for some reason. We don't know why at the moment. That's not what we're concerned with at the moment. The bicarb has gone up, so that's increased that base side of the seesaw. Now we've got acid on our base. We've increased that base side, so the pH of the acid has relatively gone down, so our pH has gone up. Yeah,
Yep.
that's gone up. So the body's gone, ooh, well, the brain's gone, ooh. Medullary CO2 receptors have gone, ooh, and the aortic and carotid bodies have gone, ooh, this is wrong. So they're going to drive now. They're seeing a alkalotic state. They don't like an alkalotic state. They want to reduce that, so they're going to increase the drive to, they're going to reduce the drive to the lungs. So then we retain some of that CO2, build it up, and that will then add an acid component to redress the balance to the alkalosis. So we end up with, we had an alkalosis leading to an alkalemia. We've got a respiratory compensation, which is a respiratory acidosis, and that's going to correct the alkalemia and bring it back to a normal level.
And I'm sure I had a case years and years ago where I had this high CO2 and I had a sick patient. In fact, I think they were diabetic, having a phaco surgery, trying to
Mm.
blast the cataract to pieces. And I don't even think we clearly hadn't blocked this patient yet, because given this neuromuscular block, because the patient was still spontaneously breathing. And I was really battling with its hypercapnia. And then it's not until we took a blood gas that I think we saw, oh, it's a compensatory hypercapnia that it's got there.
Right.
And I'm thinking, I need to get that CO2 down, down, down. And the body's probably going, this is all my hard work.
Yeah, because you had a high bicarbonate level. You had
Yeah.
a metabolic alkalosis going on there, and that CO2 was its compensation mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking, I need to get that CO2 down. Yeah, I mean, it was one way or the other. I can't quite remember the circumstance, but I remember there being a problem with the patient's CO2. And I'm thinking, or maybe it made more sense for the CO2 to be low in the diabetic patient. But I'm thinking, why is the CO2 such a problem in this patient? Grr. And then we took a blood gas. Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
it's a compensation.
Okay. And I think maybe our listeners might think, okay, well, that just threw out the window everything I wanted to do about my CO2 control, because I've always, everything you said on these podcasts is about getting it back to 40. I think you have to bear in mind that if you had that patient and it did have that degree of metabolic alkalosis, it would not be invisible to you. It would be a sick patient. So you'd know about
Yes.
it before you started the procedure. So you're not working on a baseline which is kind of obscure to you. You know the baseline's changed. You would suspect an alkalosis because of its medical condition.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very, very good point. We're not saying this is a healthy 6-month-old bitch spay or something like that. These were sick patients with huge comorbidities that were impacting the anesthesia. This wasn't still aimed to get your CO2s normal, people, and your healthy patients.
Yeah. So we got an increase in CO2 because we had a reduction in respiratory drive. So that's respiratory compensation. And we describe it as full because we've actually brought the pH back into range. It's come back to 7.44. It's less than 7.45, which is the upper limit. So it's only just in range, but it's still described as a full respiratory compensation because in fact the body's actually managed through that moderation of the breathing to bring the pH back into normal range. And in essence, this is the beginnings of normal, blood gas interpretation.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's too scary. It sort of kind of fits in with all the concepts we've been through so far. I think maybe let's do another one and just see whether we can begin to sort of cement these ideas. So let's take a pH of 7.29, a PCO2 of 59, and a bicarbonate of 22. So before we dash in, let's just look at these in turn then. So the pH is 7.29, normal or abnormal? Well, that's clearly not normal. It's dropped outside of our 7.35, hasn't it?
Yep.
So we're acidic, aren't we? So we got a low pH. So that's a major change. So we should clock that as an acidic change. Yeah. pH drop. PCO2 is 58. Is that normal? It's not, is it? That's we're way above, or 59. That's way above our 45. So our CO2 is increased. Yeah.
Yep.
And then the bicarbonate is 22. Is that in normal range? That's just in normal range. So there's no change there. So my interpretation, very similar to the way you do it, Courtney. I'm looking at that and I've got a pH which is low and I've got a CO2 that's high. Could that have caused it? That's absolutely could have caused it. You need to consider whether that's a compensation or a primary effect. Look at my bicarbonate. Bicarbonate's normal. That must have been a primary effect. What I've got here is a straightforward respiratory acidosis.
Yep.
How would you do that?
I would do the very same. So I'd look at my pH, 7.29. Okay, it's low. We're acidic. Look at our PaCO2. It's 59. It's high. We're acidic. Boom. Straight away we have our match.
Yeah.
So I would say respiratory acidosis. Is there any type? I mean, I can then go down and have a look at my bicarb and definitely rule out any kind of mixed base or whatnot. But I would look at my bicarb. It's normal. Okay, I have a very acute looking blood gas sample here of a patient that could be your everyday patient under anesthesia.
Yeah.
We've got a respiratory acidosis and there's no compensation because I know that if my kidneys are going to kick in and compensate, that's going to take hours, days to happen. So I have something very, very quick that's happening in front of me. And isn't it crazy? Seeing a PaCO2 or seeing even an end-tidal CO2 of the high 50s is an everyday occurrence for some patients that have got this respiratory, well, perhaps they've got induction apnea. That abdomen's just been insulated in the laparoscopic spay. Like, that is so real. That is a very real thing that has just happened, and our pH has gone down.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And if you want to apply some of these, formulae that you get taught about, you could work out what the pH actually is based on the PCO2, and you get the same figure. I'm talking about that Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. We don't need to go into that, but that's what this is all about. It's real. And I think we need to qualify it in the sense that what we haven't talked about, or we have talked about a little, but is the time element of this. So it's not going to kill the animal if it reaches a pH of 7.29. If it stays there for 10 minutes and then goes back to normal, it's not going to kill it. If it stays there for 20 minutes, it's not. If it stays there for 4 or 5 hours, the body's going to respond and do something. if that pH drops further and gets down into the sixes, the 6.7, 6.8s, then we're in a very different territory. But there's a whole time course of events. And I imagine things like massive physical exertion, running at full speed, for, as much as you can, you're going to induce a respiratory acidosis there that can't be compensated for immediately. You'll get a drop in blood pH, but it's very short-lived. So this has got a time element to it, but it is important that the longer it goes on, the more harmful it will be.
Yeah.
And the more it deviates from normal, the more harmful it will be. Okay, well, that was quite a good one. That was quite an easy one, wasn't it? So we'll just round things off now with end this little podcast with another one. And we're going to bring into this equation some other factors, but let's just start with the pH, the CO2, and the bicarbonate. So I've got a pH of 7.32. Got a CO2 of 34 and a bicarbonate of 14. Okay, now my approach to this would be I look at that, the pH is down. We're talking about an acidosis of some form. Now, could it be driven by CO2? Well, the CO2 would have to be high for that to be the case, but the CO2 here is low, so it can't be a respiratory acidosis. It's got to be a metabolic acidosis. Is it? I look at my bicarbonate. My carbonate is way down, so yes, this is a metabolic acidosis. And you, Courtney?
I would do, once again, a similar thing. 7.32 acid, PaCO2 34. It's more on the alk side. Bicarb low 14, acid. Which two are the acids? It is the pH is the acid, the bicarb's the acid. We have a metabolic acidosis. Go up and have a look at our PaCO2. We have a compensatory respiratory alkalosis to try. Well, we have the respiratory system trying to help there, and I can literally imagine my patient sitting in wards panting, my metabolically disturbed patient panting to try and help.
Yeah, so we've got a respiratory compensation component going on because the CO2 is depressed, so it's trying to blow off the CO2. Is it sufficient?
It's not sufficient.
It's not quite there, is it?
No, it hasn't got that pH normal.
No. So we would describe that as a partial respiratory compensation. So we got the compensatory mechanisms in place. The CO2 is down, but it's not down enough to bring that pH back up. So that's a partial respiratory compensation. Okay. So for this one, I've actually got some other values. I've got a sodium value here of 135. Yeah. And I got a chloride value of 109. So we're just going to end this off with just looking at anion gap calculations. So this is very simple, and there are a number of ways of doing this, and lots of different texts and procedures for doing it. I like this the way I've discovered and found this system, because it's kind of keeps it simple. And I know it has limitations, but I think for me it keeps it nice and simple. I just want to look at sodium, chloride, and potassium, and I'm looking for the difference between those. And I'm looking for a normal gap, this anion gap of 12. So let's see what we get. So we've got 135, take away the sum of 109 plus 14. Yeah. I say the sum of because I'm taking the sodium and taking away from that the combined chloride and bicarbonate, because the sodium is the positive, chloride and the bicarbonate are the negatives. So 109 and 14 is 123. 135 take away 123 equals 12. Yep, so my anion gap is 12. Now, in the system I use, anion gap of 12 or less is normal. So what that means is that we've got a acidosis here that's being caused by changes in the electrolytes in the body, not by external volatile acids. There's not another lactic acid component. There's not a keto diabetic component. This is just by electrolyte disturbances in the body. Yeah. So I like this system. Calculate that anion gap. If it's less than 12, then it's uncomplicated. If it's more than 12, then it suggests that there's another component. So we've got either a metabolic or a as a metabolic component, and then we have to work on that to decide what that metabolic component is, and have to remember life isn't always simple. You could have a metabolic acidosis at the same time as you've got a metabolic alkalosis, at the same time as you've got a respiratory acidosis. So and it's the balance between all those, and often, they do occur concurrently. And thinking about it here, we like to keep them separate, but they do occur concurrently. So when you start to get down to this level of inspection, we then go into calculating something called a delta ratio. We start to look at that delta ratio and begin to work out whether the effect is dominated by a metabolic alkalosis, whether it's dominated by acidosis, whether it's a mixture of a normal anion gap, so by the electrolyte disturbances, and what the mixture is. So I don't want to go into that there. That's a lot more involved than I think we want to be here today. And I think we're getting to a point where we've nearly got to the hour. Just wanted to show people that that's why these other figures start to come in on your blood gas analysis. So, and then take it a step further, you have these things called like basic success. Again, don't want to get into basic success here. I think maybe that'll be something we talk about in another time. I think if we start talking about basic success, or start to cloud some of the really fundamental concepts we've talked about today. Yeah. So I think we've talked for nearly an hour again or so on introduction to acid base, and we've gone through some examples, and hopefully that's given people an approach and a more clear understanding of acid base. Yeah,
I think so. I think it's really nice just to make it as simple as you've explained, in that we have these 4 types of disturbances: the respiratory acidosis, alkalosis, metabolic acidosis, alkalosis, or processes. And then once you start looking at your blood gas, just look at 3 things. Look at the pH, the CO2, and the bicarb. And you'll feel really good when you're able to go, I know what's actually happening. And then as you become more confident, then you can start looking at anion gaps. Why is this happening? What's contributing to that? What is the basic access? How could we treat it? Do that. Break your learning into 2 parts. The first part, just enjoy knowing that you've learned something actually quite exciting and quite new, and that you can look at a blood gas and have an idea on what state the patient's in. And then you can figure out with your vets later about treatment for it. But I think keep it nice and simple.
Yeah. And I think because this has all been driven by, your and my interest in ventilation and monitoring, let's just take the most common thing you're going to see, that respiratory acidosis. Very clear. As our second example, low pH, high CO2, normal bicarbonate, classic respiratory acidosis. Just get that one in your brain. Yep. And as soon as you see it on paper, you'll go, oh, I know what that is now. Low pH, high CO2, normal bicarbonate, got to be a respiratory acidosis. Yep. And when you see those, then you're there. That once you begin to recognize those, then the others will start to fall into place.
Absolutely.
So okay, well, I hope that's been helpful for people. I think it is a complex subject, but it can just be broken down into basics, what goes on in the body. I think that really concludes series 3 then, Courtney.
That's actually the end of series 3.
It's the end of series 3. So now we've got to go away and think about what we're going to do for series 4. Well, we've got some ideas, haven't we?
We've got some ideas. Really exciting ideas.
Can we tell them any ideas? These ideas?
I think, go on. I think we should.
Okay, so what we're hoping to do in early October? Yeah, early October is to run some live podcasts at the BB&A meeting in Telford, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
In Telford. So we'll have a room where Courtney and I will sit up where we want an invited audience, so that we can have the conversation between Courtney and I, but with audience interaction, so that they can drive some of the questions and really get to grips on some topics. And our chosen topic, our topic that we'd like to talk about, is going to be entitled Hazards of Anaesthesia. So we're going to look at what goes on in anaesthesia and why, and what the hazards are from the beginning of the day. You start, you look at your equipment, your intubation, your induction, all that, right through to full recovery. There are lots of hazards in there, and we've got all the tools to detect and respond to those hazards. And I think we're just going to have a series of podcasts. How many are we doing on is it 3, Courtney?
At BVNA.
BVNA, yeah.
We've got 2. We'll record 2 live with the audience, and then and then we'll do the rest usual style.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll have 2 live podcasts at BVNA looking at the hazards of anaesthesia, and I hope that's going to open up a lot of questions and bring in a lot of concepts about all the things we talked about.
I'm excited. I'm really excited for that. I'm always excited to talk nerdy.
Yeah. I think that'll be fun. So I look forward to seeing people there. And thank you for listening to this series of podcasts. Please send us comments and any any sort of feedback you have to us. That'd be great. The clinical support at burtons.uk.com, and we get them there. Okay. Thanks again, Courtney.
Talk to you later, Keith.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Don't forget to follow our podcast on your chosen platform to stay up to date with the latest episode, and feel free to share with your team. If you have any questions or feedback for us, or simply want to know more about what you've just heard, please send us an email to clinicalsupport@burtons.uk.com. Catch you next time.